Montana Territory, 1873. The last rays of sunlight stretched across the dusty main street of Timber Creek like fingers reaching for the horizon before night would claim the land. In this unforgiving corner of the West, most men measured their worth in acres, cattle heads, or notches on a gun belt. Vaughn Young was no different. At 25, he'd already seen enough bloodshed and broken promises to last several lifetimes, leaving him with one unshakable conviction. A man survives longest when he rides alone. The late September wind carried a biting chill as Vaughn guided his chestnut mare down the town's main thoroughfare. His lean frame sat easy in the saddle, though his eyes, sharp and alert as a hawk's, never stopped scanning his surroundings. Beneath his weathered Stetson, his face was handsome in a rugged way, with 2 days of stubble shadowing a strong jaw and cheekbones that spoke of his mother's Cherokee blood. The West takes more than it gives, his father had told him before a Sioux arrow found his heart. Vaughn had been 17 then, and 8 years of drifting had only proven the old man right. The frontier demanded everything: blood, sweat, dreams, and offered little in return except for hard lessons and early graves. Vaughn had come to Timber Creek chasing work, not connections. The Double J Ranch needed experienced hands for a cattle drive to Wyoming, and he needed the money to keep moving. Winter was coming, and he had no intention of being caught in one place when the snow fell. Staying put meant getting attached. Getting attached meant eventual heartbreak when the land, outlaws, or disease took what you loved. Better to keep moving, keep free, keep alone. He dismounted outside the Frontier Saloon, its windows glowing with lantern light like a beacon in the growing darkness. Inside, he'd find the ranch foreman who was hiring, maybe a hot meal, and certainly a whiskey to warm his bones. What he didn't expect to find was anything or anyone who might challenge the armor he'd built around himself. "Take care of her," he told the stable boy who appeared to take his horse, slipping the kid a coin. "She's all I've got." The saloon doors swung open, releasing a wave of piano music, tobacco smoke, and raucous laughter. Vaughn paused at the threshold, taking in the scene with practiced caution. The place was busy but not crowded, filled with the usual assortment of cowboys, miners, and town folk, unwilling to face another lonely night in empty homes. He was halfway to the bar when he saw her. Candace Ackerman sat alone at a corner table, her slender fingers wrapped around a glass of something that wasn't whiskey. At 23, she was a study in contrasts against the rough-hewn backdrop of the saloon. Her dress, though simple, was well-made, its deep green fabric complementing the rich honey blonde of her hair, which she wore pinned up in a style more practical than fashionable. Her face, framed by loose tendrils that had escaped their pins, possessed a quiet beauty that seemed out of place in this frontier outpost. But it was her eyes that stopped Vaughn in his tracks, not their striking hazel color, but the depth of sorrow in them. He recognized that look. It was the same one that had greeted him in the mirror every morning after burying his father. Candace felt his gaze before she saw him. Looking up, she met the stranger's eyes across the room. For a moment neither looked away. Then, remembering herself, she glanced down at her glass of lemonade, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. Vaughn broke the connection first, continuing to the bar where he ordered whiskey and asked about the Double J foreman. The barkeep nodded toward a table where a heavy-set man with an impressive mustache was playing cards. "That's Miller," the barkeep said, "hiring for the drive, but I'd wait till he finishes his hand. He's superstitious about business talk during poker." Vaughn nodded his thanks, throwing back his whiskey and ordering another. He felt rather than saw the blonde woman rise from her table and approach the bar. "Another lemonade, please, mister." "Hollies," she said, her voice soft but clear, with an educated Eastern accent that stood out in this rough establishment. "Coming right up, Mrs. Ackerman," the barkeep replied with a kindness absent from his interactions with most patrons. "How are you faring tonight?" "Well enough," she answered with a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. Mrs. Ackerman, the title registered in Vaughn's mind, married woman, none of his business. Yet he couldn't help noticing the absence of a husband, the plain black ribbon on her sleeve, and the way other patrons gave her a wide berth, as though her widowhood might be contagious. "Passing through?" she asked suddenly, surprising Vaughn by addressing him directly. He turned to face her, keeping his expression neutral. "Looking for work, cattle drive to Wyoming." She nodded. "Miller's a fair man, tough but honest. If you know your business, he'll treat you right." "You know the outfit?" Vaughn asked, curiosity getting the better of his usual reticence with strangers. "My husband," she started, then paused, the words clearly still difficult. "My late husband supplied horses to most of the ranches around here. I've kept the business going since his passing." 6 months ago, the influenza that had swept through the town had taken Thomas Ackerman, leaving Candace alone to manage not only her grief, but the horse trading business that had been their livelihood. The locals called her the widow in hushed tones, some with pity, others with judgment. A woman had no business running such an enterprise, they said. She should sell, they advised. Find another husband, they insisted. But Candace had always been stubborn, even before tragedy had hardened her resolve. The world takes what it wants, her mother had warned her before consumption claimed her back in Philadelphia. A woman must hold tight to what's hers. At 18, Candace had married Thomas and followed him west, drawn by his dreams of building something that would last. At 23, she was determined to honor those dreams even if she had to do it alone. Valley Ranch, she continued, north of town, we raised quarter horses mostly. Vaughn nodded, noting her use of we and the present tense when speaking of the ranch. Good stock for cutting cattle. The best, she replied, a hint of pride breaking through her composure. Are you a horseman, mister? Young's Vaughn Young. And yes, ma'am, when the situation calls for it. The conversation might have ended there, two strangers exchanging pleasantries before returning to their respective solitudes, if fate hadn't intervened in the form of three trail-worn men who burst through the saloon doors with the force of an incoming storm. The piano player stopped mid-song, conversations died, even the card players froze with their hands hovering over chips and cards. Well, ain't this cozy, drawled the tallest of the three, a lanky man with eyes cold as river stones. His gaze swept the room, lingering momentarily on Candace before settling on Vaughn. New face in town, interesting timing. Vaughn kept his expression neutral, though his right hand instinctively moved closer to his holstered Colt. These men had the look of trouble, trail dust mixed with an arrogance that came from believing themselves beyond the reach of law or consequence. Something we can help you with, Harmon. Miller, the ranch foreman, stood up from his card game. Just looking for a drink and some answers, the man called Harmon replied. Heard someone's been asking about my brother down in Dry Creek, thought maybe news had reached this backwater. Candace stiffened beside Vaughn. He didn't miss the way her knuckles whitened around her glass, or the flash of fear that crossed her face before she schooled her features into a mask of indifference. Can't help you, Miller said. Haven't been that way in months. Harmon's gaze drifted back to Candace, a slow, unsettling smile spreading across his face. Evening, Mrs. Ackerman, ranch still standing. Must be hard, woman trying to do a man's job. My ranch is not your concern, Mr. Harmon, she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor Vaughn detected in her hands. Could be, Harmon said, taking a step toward the bar. I make a fair offer last month, still stands. You should reconsider, especially with winter coming. The threat behind his words was clear as glass. Vaughn found himself shifting slightly, placing his body between Harmon and Candace in a movement so subtle it might have been accidental. The lady said it's not your concern, Vaughn said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of steel. Sounds like that should be the end of it. A dangerous silence fell over the saloon. Harmon's hand hovered near his gun, his two companions spreading out to flank him. Vaughn didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even blink. 8 years of drifting had taught him to read men like Harmon, bullies who backed down when faced with someone who might actually fight back. Don't recall asking your opinion, stranger, Harmon said. This is private business between me and the widow. Not in my establishment, the barkeep interjected, producing a shotgun from beneath the counter. Take your business outside or take it nowhere, Harmon. For a tense moment, it seemed Harmon might ignore the warning. Then he laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. Another time then, he said, backing toward the door. Just remember what I said, Mrs. Ackerman. Winter's coming and a woman alone faces all kinds of dangers. After they left, the saloon gradually returned to life, though conversations were more subdued, the piano player choosing gentler melodies. Vaughn remained where he was, acutely aware of Candace beside him, the faint scent of lavender soap rising from her skin. Thank you, she said at last, her voice barely audible over the renewed murmur of the saloon. Vaughn nodded once. No need for thanks. Men like that only understand one thing. Vors, she finished for him. Yes, I'm learning that the hard way. She hesitated, then added, they want my land, the water rights specifically. There's a year-round spring that feeds the north pasture. And your husband wouldn't sell. Neither will I, her chin lifted slightly, a gesture of defiance that seemed at odds with her delicate appearance. Miller approached them, his poker game apparently finished. Young, is it? Heard you're looking for work on the drive. That's right, Vaughn replied, turning his attention to the foreman while remaining conscious of Candace still standing nearby. Ever run cattle before? 3 seasons with the Bar T out of Texas, 2 with Goodnight's outfit after that. Miller's bushy eyebrows rose. Goodnight's a tough master. If you survived that, you'll do. We leave at first light day after tomorrow. Pays $3 a day, half now, half when we deliver. Fair enough, Vaughn said, shaking the foreman's offered hand. As Miller returned to his table, Candace spoke again. Mr. Young, if you're looking for a place to stay until the drive, Valley Ranch has a spare cabin. It's simple but clean, and I could use help with some repairs before winter sets in. The offer surprised Vaughn as much as it seemed to surprise Candace herself, judging by the color rising in her cheeks. That is, if you're interested in extra work, she added quickly. Paid, of course. Every instinct honed by years of solitary survival told Vaughn to refuse. Getting involved with the widow, her troubles with Harmon, or anything that might complicate his plan to take his pay and move on before winter, was asking for trouble. The frontier had no patience for those who let sentiment cloud judgment, yet he found himself saying, "Much obliged, Mrs. Ackerman, I accept." As they rode out of town together in the gathering darkness, Vaughn told himself it was practicality, not the unexpected connection he'd felt when their eyes met, that had made him accept her offer. A warm cabin and extra pay before a long cattle drive was simply good sense. It was the first of many lies he would tell himself about Candace Ackerman. Valley Ranch lay nestled against the foothills of the Bitterroot Mountains, its buildings arranged around a central yard with precision that spoke of Thomas Ackerman's Eastern sensibilities. The main house was modest but well built, with a covered porch and glass windows, luxuries in this part of the territory. A large barn, corral, and several smaller outbuildings completed the picture of a prosperous small ranch. What caught Vaughn's attention, however, were the horses. Even in the moonlight, he could see the quality of the stock in the corral, muscular quarter horses with good conformation, the kind that would fetch top prices from any outfit that valued dependable cutting horses. Thomas had an eye for bloodlines, Candace said, following his gaze as they dismounted near the barn. Said you could tell a horse's heart by looking at its eyes. Smart man, Vaughn replied. The mare he rode was proof enough of that philosophy, all heart and intelligence beneath her chestnut coat. The cabin is this way, she said, leading him toward a small structure set apart from the main house. It's where our ranch hands stayed when we had them. You're alone here now, Vaughn asked, frowning at the thought of her defending this place by herself. Since Thomas died, yes, I had to let the hands go. Couldn't afford to keep them on, not with the medical bills and, she trailed off, then squared her shoulders. But I manage. The horses mostly care for themselves and I can handle the basic work. The cabin was simple but, as promised, clean. A single room with a bed, table, 2 chairs, and a small stove. Candace lit a lamp, illuminating the space with warm light. There's fresh water in the bucket, and I'll bring breakfast in the morning, she said, hovering in the doorway. We can discuss the repairs then. Vaughn set his saddlebags on the table. Those men, Harmon and his friends, they've threatened you before. Candace hesitated, then nodded. Harmon owns the Circle H southwest of here. He's been trying to buy Valley Ranch since before Thomas died. Offers keep getting lower, threats keep getting higher. She gave a small, bitter laugh. He thinks I'll break because I'm a woman alone. Why stay? The question escaped before Vaughn could stop it. Forgive me, but there must be safer places for a widow. This land is all I have left of my husband, she answered simply, and I promised him I'd keep it. Besides, where would I go? Back east to relatives who warned me not to come west in the first place, or perhaps I should take one of the marriage proposals I've received since Thomas died, men who want my land more than they want a wife. She shook her head. No, I stay and fight. Looking at her in the lamplight, Vaughn saw past the delicate features to the steel beneath. This woman had faced death, grief, and threats with a courage many men would envy. It was admirable if foolhardy. Well, he said finally, a few repairs and a cattle drive won't solve your problems, Mrs. Ackerman, but I'm at your service until I leave. Candace, she said, if you're staying on my land, you might as well use my name. Candace, he repeated, the name feeling strange yet right on his tongue. Good night, then. Good night, Vaughn, she replied, and was gone, leaving only the scent of lavender and the impression of quiet strength in her wake. Alone in the cabin, Vaughn removed his gun belt and boots, stretching out on the bed with his hands behind his head. Outside, an owl called into the night, answered by the distant howl of a wolf. familiar sounds of the wilderness that had been his only constant companion for years. Yet tonight, for the first time in longer than he could remember, Vaughn Young felt the stirring of something he'd thought long dead, a sense that perhaps there were still things in this harsh world worth fighting for, worth staying for. It was a dangerous thought for a man who survived by staying unattached, and he pushed it away as he drifted into sleep. But the seed had been planted, and like all seeds in fertile ground, it would grow whether he willed it or not. Dawn arrived with the rich aroma of coffee and the sound of someone moving about outside the cabin. Vaughn was instantly awake, gun in hand before his eyes were fully open, another habit born of years on the trail where a moment's inattention could mean death. A knock at the door was followed by Candace's voice. "Breakfast if you're awake." He pulled on his boots and shirt, running a hand through his dark hair before opening the door. Candace stood there with a basket covered by a checkered cloth, looking as fresh as the morning itself in a simple blue dress, her honey-blonde hair braided and pinned up. "I hope you slept well," she said, stepping past him to set the basket on the table. "I've brought coffee, biscuits, and some bacon, and there's preserves, wild huckleberry, I put them up last summer." "Thank you," Vaughn said, suddenly aware of how long it had been since anyone had shown him such simple kindness. "You didn't have to go to the trouble." "It's no trouble, I was cooking for myself anyway." She began unpacking the basket, setting out 2 plates and cups. "I thought we might discuss the work while we eat, if that's agreeable." They sat across from each other at the small table, the morning light streaming through the cabin's single window, casting golden patterns across the worn wood. Candace poured coffee for them both, then outlined the repairs needed: fence posts along the north pasture, a leaking roof on the chicken coop, reinforcement for the barn door before winter winds set in. "Nothing too demanding," she concluded, "but beyond what I can manage alone." "Should be able to handle most of it today," Vaughn said between bites of biscuit spread with the sweet tart preserves. "The fence might take longer, depending on how many posts need replacing." "I appreciate the help," she said, her eyes meeting his briefly before looking away. "It's been difficult doing everything alone." There was vulnerability in that admission, and Vaughn found himself wanting to ease her burden somehow. "Your husband," he began, then paused, uncertain if he was overstepping. "He built all this himself." "We built it together," she corrected gently. "Thomas had the vision, but I was beside him every step. We came here 5 years ago with little more than dreams and determination." "That's more than most have," Vaughn observed. "And you," she asked, "what brings a man like you to Timber Creek besides the cattle drive?" Vaughn considered deflecting the question as he typically would, keeping his past and his reasons to himself. Yet something about the quiet morning and Candace's direct gaze made him answer honestly. "I go where the work is, have been since my father died 8 years back, no real destination in mind." "That sounds lonely," she said, without judgment or pity, simply stating what she observed. "Safer that way," he replied. "The frontier doesn't reward those who put down roots too deep." "Yet here we are," Candace said, gesturing to encompass the ranch around them, "putting down roots despite the risks." "Here you are," Vaughn corrected. "I'll be gone with the cattle drive." Something like disappointment flickered across her face, but she covered it quickly with a smile. "Well then, we should make the most of your time here. Shall we start with the chicken coop?" The day passed in steady work, the kind that left little room for conversation but created its own rhythm of shared purpose. Vaughn repaired the chicken coop roof while Candace tended to the horses, each occasionally glancing at the other when they thought themselves unobserved. By midday they had moved on to the barn door, working side by side to reattach hinges that had loosened over time. The physical closeness was both uncomfortable and strangely familiar, as if they had done this 100 times before. "Hand me that hammer," Vaughn asked, holding a nail in place. Candace passed it to him, their fingers brushing momentarily, "like this." "Perfect," he said, driving the nail home with 3 precise strikes. "You've done this before." "Thomas believed a woman should know how to handle tools as well as a needle," she explained. "Said you never know when you might need to fix something yourself." "Wise man." "He was," she agreed, a shadow crossing her face. Though perhaps not wise enough to see the influenza coming, or to listen when the doctor told him to rest instead of checking on a mare about to foal in freezing rain. Vaughn paused in his work, hearing the grief and anger beneath her words. "Some things can't be prevented, no matter how careful we are." "Is that why you keep moving?" she asked. "Because you know that staying won't prevent the bad things from happening?" The question struck too close to truths Vaughn rarely acknowledged, even to himself. Something like that, he admitted. My father used to say the West takes more than it gives. I've found that to be true. And yet it gives nonetheless, Candace countered. It gave me 5 years with Thomas, a home, purpose. She looked out across the ranch, her expression softening. Beauty that still takes my breath away. Before Vaughn could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. 3 riders were coming up the long drive to the ranch house, and even at a distance Vaughn recognized the lead rider's lanky frame. Harmon, Candace breathed, her face paling. Vaughn instinctively moved to stand between her and the approaching riders. Stay behind me. This is my land, she protested. I won't hide. I didn't say hide, Vaughn replied. I said stay behind me. There's a difference. They watched as the 3 men rode into the yard, the same trio from the saloon the previous night. Harmon's cold eyes took in the scene, Vaughn and Candace standing by the barn, the repairs visibly in progress, the subtle protective stance Vaughn had adopted. Mrs. Ackerman, Harmon called, tipping his hat with mocking politeness. Found yourself a new hand, I see, or perhaps something more. State your business, Harmon, Candace said, her voice steady despite the fear Vaughn sensed in her. Same as always, I'm offering to buy your ranch. Price is still reasonable, considering. Harmon dismounted, handing his reins to one of his companions. Considering what? Vaughn asked. Harmon's gaze flicked to him, dismissive yet cautious. Considering the winter coming. Considering a woman alone can't manage a place this size. Considering accidents happen. The threat hung in the air like gunsmoke. My answer hasn't changed, Candace said. Valley Ranch isn't for sale. Not to you, not to anyone. Harmon took a step forward, his hand resting casually on his holstered gun. Your husband was stubborn too, look where that got him. Vaughn moved then, a fluid motion that placed him directly in Harmon's path. You've delivered your offer, it's been declined, time for you to leave. And if I don't, Harmon asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous drawl. Then I'll have to insist, Vaughn replied calmly, and I don't think you want that. The standoff stretched, tension building like a thunderhead before a storm. Vaughn stood relaxed yet ready, his years of surviving in the lawless territories evident in his stance and unwavering gaze. Finally Harmon laughed, though the sound held no mirth. Well, the widow's found herself a guard dog. He backed up a step, then another. Enjoy the protection while it lasts, Mrs. Ackerman. Word is he's riding out with the Double J drive, then you'll be alone again. He mounted his horse, gathering the reins. My offer stands until the first snow, after that, well, he shrugged, leaving the implications hanging. Things get harder in winter. They watched in silence as the 3 riders departed, dust rising in their wake like a malevolent spirit. Only when they were well down the road did Candace release the breath she'd been holding. Are you all right? Vaughn asked, turning to her. She nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. He's never been quite so bold before or threatening. He's getting desperate, Vaughn observed. Which makes him more dangerous. What am I going to do? She whispered, the question seemingly directed more at herself than at him. He's right about one thing, you'll be gone with the cattle drive, and then I'll be alone again. The vulnerability in her voice stirred something protective in Vaughn, a feeling almost forgotten in his years of solitary wandering. You could sell, he suggested, though the words tasted bitter on his tongue. Start fresh somewhere safer. Candace's eyes flashed with sudden anger. Is that what you do when faced with men like Harmon? Run. Find somewhere safer, she shook her head firmly. This is my home, I won't be bullied off it. Her fierceness surprised and impressed him. Then we need to make sure you can defend it, he said. Do you have a gun? Thomas's rifle. I'm a fair shot, he taught me. Good. That's a start. They spent the remainder of the afternoon finishing the barn door repairs, but the easy rhythm of their earlier work had been replaced by a watchful tension. Vaughn found himself constantly scanning the horizon, alert for any sign of Harmon's return. As dusk approached, they moved to the fence line along the north pasture. Several posts needed replacing where winter frost had heaved them from the ground. It was hard work, digging out the old posts and setting new ones, but Vaughn welcomed the physical exertion as a counterpoint to the unease that had settled over him since Harmon's visit. Candace worked alongside him, her determination evident in every swing of the shovel, every post she helped steady while he tamped the earth around it. They spoke little, conserving energy for the task, but the silence between them had evolved from the awkwardness of strangers to the comfortable quiet of shared purpose. The last one, Candace said finally, wiping sweat from her brow as they finished securing the final post. The setting sun cast long shadows across the pasture, turning the grass to gold and the distant mountains to purple silhouettes against the darkening sky. Should hold through winter, Vaughn said, gathering the tools, and probably a few more after that. Thank you, she said simply, for everything today, the repairs and standing up to Harmon. Vaughn nodded, uncomfortable with her gratitude. He hadn't done anything extraordinary, just what any decent man would do. Yet the way she looked at him, as if he'd performed some great service, made him acutely aware of how long it had been since he'd connected with another human being beyond the superficial interactions of trail life. As they walked back toward the main house, the day's labor evident in their tired steps, Candace suddenly stopped. "Will you stay for supper?" she asked. "I have a stew simmering and there's fresh bread." The invitation hung between them, weighted with unspoken possibilities. Vaughn knew the sensible answer was no. Sharing a meal in her home, sitting across from her at a family table, these were acts of intimacy that blurred the lines he had carefully drawn around himself for years. Yet he found himself saying, "I'd like that," the words emerging before reason could override them. The main house was warm and welcoming, the front room simply but comfortably furnished with pieces that spoke of an Eastern upbringing tempered by practical frontier needs. A fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel adorned with a few treasured possessions. A small clock, a daguerreotype of a younger Candace with a tall, bearded man who must have been Thomas, a worn Bible. The kitchen beyond was clearly the heart of the home, with a large cast-iron stove, a sturdy table with 4 chairs, and shelves lined with preserves and dry goods. A pot of stew bubbled on the stove, filling the air with savory aromas that reminded Vaughn of how long it had been since he'd eaten a proper home-cooked meal. "Please sit," Candace said, gesturing to the table while she moved to the stove. "Would you like coffee?" "Yes, thank you," Vaughn replied, suddenly feeling out of place in this domestic setting. He removed his hat, running a hand through his hair in a futile attempt to tame it after a day's work. Candace served the stew in thick ceramic bowls, placing a loaf of fresh bread between them on the table. She moved with the easy grace of someone comfortable in their domain, and Vaughn found himself watching her hands as she poured coffee into mismatched cups, strong, capable hands that betrayed her frontier life despite their feminine appearance. "It's nothing fancy," she said, finally sitting across from him, "but it's hot and filling." "It smells wonderful," Vaughn assured her, waiting for her to begin before picking up his spoon. The first taste confirmed his assessment: rich broth, tender meat, vegetables grown in her own garden, simple fare but prepared with care and skill. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, the day's tension gradually easing from their shoulders as the warm food did its work. Outside, night had fallen completely, the only sounds the occasional whicker of horses in the barn and the distant call of a night bird. "May I ask you something?" Candace said finally, breaking the silence. Vaughn nodded, setting down his spoon. "You can ask." "Why do you keep moving?" she asked. "What are you looking for out there?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. Most people in the territories had learned not to pry into a man's reasons for drifting. The West was full of secrets, pasts better left unexamined. "Not looking for anything in particular," he answered carefully. "Just staying ahead of trouble." "Is someone after you?" "No," he smiled faintly. "Nothing like that. Just learned early that staying in one place too long invites complications." "Complications," she repeated, her eyes studying his face. "You mean connections, people who might care if you live or die." Her perception was uncomfortably accurate. "Those two," he admitted. "The frontier's a hard place, Candace. People who get attached end up heartbroken more often than not." "So you choose loneliness as a preventative measure." There was no judgment in her tone, only curiosity. "I choose freedom," he countered, "the ability to move on when necessary without entanglements." Candace considered this, absently breaking off a piece of bread. "I chose the opposite," she said finally. "Entanglements, as you call them, roots." A home, she looked around the kitchen, her expression softening with memory. "Even knowing how it might end, and it did end, with Thomas dying far too young, I would choose it again." "Why?" Vaughn asked, genuinely curious. "Because the joy of loving, of building something that matters, of belonging somewhere and to someone, that outweighs the pain of loss." She met his gaze directly. "At least it does for me." Her words struck a chord in Vaughn, resonating with questions he'd pushed aside in his years of wandering. Was freedom from pain worth the absence of joy? Was safety from loss worth the emptiness of never truly connecting? Before he could formulate a response, a sound from outside broke the moment, horses approaching at a gallop, multiple riders by the sound. Vaughn was on his feet instantly, extinguishing the lamp with a quick movement that plunged the kitchen into darkness broken only by the glow from the stove. "Stay here," he said, drawing his revolver and moving toward the front room. "It could be neighbors," Candace suggested, though her tone indicated she didn't believe it. "Neighbors don't ride like that after dark," Vaughn replied, peering cautiously through the front window. In the moonlight, he could make out 5 riders approaching the house, torches held high. "It's Harmon, and he's brought more men." Candace appeared beside him, her face pale in the dim light. "They have torches." "Get your husband's rifle," Vaughn instructed, his voice calm despite the urgency of the situation. "Then the ammunition, quickly." She moved without question, returning moments later with a Winchester repeating rifle and a box of cartridges. Vaughn noted with approval that she handled the weapon with confidence, checking that it was loaded before passing it to him. "5 against 1, she said, her voice steady despite the fear evident in her eyes. "Those aren't good odds." "5 against 2, Vaughn corrected. "Can you still shoot?" A small, fierce smile touched her lips. "Yes." "Good, take my revolver, stay back from the windows, but be ready." He handed her his Colt, then took up position beside the front door, the rifle ready. "Let me do the talking first. Maybe they're just trying to frighten you." The riders stopped in the yard, their torches casting eerie, dancing shadows across the ground. Harmon's voice carried clearly through the night air. "Mrs. Ackerman. Come out and talk business like civilized folk." Vaughn opened the door a crack, keeping his body shielded. "Harmon, you're trespassing on private property. Turn around and leave." A burst of laughter greeted his words. "The guard dog speaks," Harmon called. "Tell your mistress to come out or we start with the barn. Horses fetch a good price, even half burned." "You burn anything on this property, you won't live to spend whatever price you get," Vaughn replied, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of a man who had faced death before and wasn't afraid to meet it again. There was a moment of silence, then the sound of muttered conversation among the riders. Finally, Harmon spoke again. "Last chance, Mrs. Ackerman. Sell now, or there won't be anything left to sell by morning." Vaughn glanced at Candace, who stood a few feet behind him, the revolver held steady in her hands. The look in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. She wouldn't yield, not to threats, not to fear. This land was hers and she would defend it. "Your call," he said quietly. She moved to stand beside him, their shoulders almost touching in the narrow space by the door. "This is Candace Ackerman," she called out, her voice remarkably strong. "I've given you my answer, Harmon. Valley Ranch is not for sale, not today, not tomorrow, not ever. Now get off my land before I put a bullet in you myself." The silence that followed her declaration was profound, broken only by the snorting of horses and the crackling of torches. Then Harmon laughed, a harsh sound that held more menace than mirth. "You've made your choice, widow. Now live with the consequences." One of the riders spurred his horse toward the barn, torch held high. Without hesitation, Vaughn raised the Winchester and fired a warning shot that kicked up dirt directly in front of the horse's hooves. The animal reared, nearly unseating its rider. "That was your only warning," Vaughn called. "Next one won't miss." Chaos erupted as the riders scattered, seeking cover behind the water trough and corral fence. A shot rang out, splintering wood near the doorway. Vaughn pulled Candace down as more bullets followed, peppering the front of the house. "Stay low," he instructed, moving to a window for a better angle. The Winchester cracked again as he fired at a shadow moving toward the chicken coop, and a cry of pain told him the shot had found its mark. "4 left," he said grimly. Candace crawled to another window, peering cautiously over the sill. "I see 2 by the corral," she whispered. "Can you hit them?" She nodded, took a deep breath, and squeezed the trigger twice in rapid succession. A shout confirmed at least one shot had connected. The firefight continued for what seemed like hours but was likely only minutes, a deadly dance of muzzle flashes in the darkness, the crack of gunfire, and the occasional cry of pain. Vaughn moved methodically from window to window, his shots carefully placed, while Candace held her position, guarding the approach to the front door. Finally, a voice called out from the darkness. "Harmon's hit bad. We need to get him to a doctor." "Then go," Vaughn shouted back, "and don't come back." There was the sound of horses being mounted, hurried movements, and then the receding thunder of hooves as the raiders departed, leaving behind one fallen man moaning in the dirt beside the chicken coop. Vaughn waited, counting to 100 to ensure it wasn't a trick before cautiously opening the door. "Stay here," he told Candace. "I'll check the wounded man." but she was already beside him, rifle now in her hands. We go together. They approached the fallen man carefully, weapons ready. He was young, barely 20, clutching a bloody shoulder and watching their approach with terrified eyes. Please, he gasped. I didn't want to come. Harmon made me. Candace lowered her rifle slightly. You were willing to burn my home. I'm sorry, the young man said, his face pale with pain and fear. He said nobody would get hurt, just scare you into selling. Vaughn knelt beside him, examining the wound. Bullet went through clean. You'll live, assuming infection doesn't set in. He looked up at Candace. What do you want to do with him? She studied the wounded man, her expression unreadable in the moonlight. Then she sighed. Bring him inside. We'll patch him up, then take him to the sheriff in the morning. And his friends, Vaughn asked. They'll either return with more men or Harmon's wound will make them reconsider, she replied pragmatically. Either way, we should be prepared. Together, they helped the young man into the house, Candace gathering bandages and whiskey for the wound while Vaughn kept watch at the window. The night remained quiet, the only sounds the wounded man's occasional groans and the normal settling of the house. Do you think they'll come back tonight? Candace asked softly as she finished bandaging their reluctant guest, who had passed out from the combination of pain and whiskey. No, Vaughn replied, but tomorrow. That depends on how badly Harmon's hit and how much he wants your land. She nodded, washing blood from her hands in a basin of water. Then we have until tomorrow. There was something in her tone, a resignation, a weariness, that made Vaughn turn to look at her fully. In the lamplight, with her honey-blonde hair coming loose from its pins and smudges of dirt and gunpowder on her face, she looked both vulnerable and indomitable, a study in contrasts that fascinated him. You fought well, he said simply. A small, tired smile touched her lips. So did you, thank you again. No need for thanks, he replied automatically. There is, she insisted. You could have ridden away this morning, taken the Double J job and never looked back. Instead, you stayed and risked your life for a stranger's ranch. You're not exactly a stranger anymore, Vaughn said, the admission surprising him as much as it seemed to surprise her. Their eyes met across the room, and in that moment something shifted between them, a recognition of the connection that had been building since their first meeting in the saloon. It wasn't just attraction, though that was undeniably present. It was something deeper, a recognition of kindred spirits despite their different paths. The wounded man stirred, breaking the moment. Candace moved to check on him, adjusting the blanket she'd placed over his shivering form. You should rest, Vaughn said. I'll keep watch. We both need rest, she countered. We can take turns. In the end, they compromised. Candace slept on the sofa in the front room while Vaughn sat in a chair by the window, rifle across his lap, watching the moonlit yard for any sign of Harmon's return. The night passed slowly, each creak of the house, each rustle of wind through the trees snapping him to alertness. Around midnight, Candace awoke and insisted on taking her turn at watch. Vaughn reluctantly agreed, stretching out on the sofa she had vacated, its cushions still warm from her body. Despite his intention to remain partially alert, exhaustion claimed him completely. He slept deeply, dreamlessly, and awoke with a start to find morning sunlight streaming through the windows and the smell of coffee filling the house. Candace stood at the stove, her back to him as she prepared breakfast. The wounded man sat at the table, his arm in a sling fashioned from a torn sheet, looking pale but considerably less frightened than the night before. Morning, Vaughn said, sitting up and running a hand through his disheveled hair. Candace turned, a smile warming her face. Good morning, I was beginning to think you might sleep through breakfast. Should have woken me earlier, he said, embarrassed at having slept so soundly while danger still lurked. You needed the rest, she replied simply, setting a plate of eggs and bacon before the wounded man before turning back to serve Vaughn. Besides, our guest has been quite informative this morning. The young man, Jimmy Newell was his name, they had learned, nodded nervously. Told Mrs. Ackerman everything, about Harmon's plans for the water rights, about the men he's brought in from outside the territory. And, Vaughn prompted, accepting the coffee Candace handed him. Harmon's bad hurt, Jimmy said. Bullet caught him in the chest. They were taking him to Doc Simmons when I last saw them, but, he shook his head, don't think he'll make it. The news hung in the air, its implications clear. If Harmon died, his men might scatter or they might seek revenge. We need to get to town, Vaughn decided. Talk to the sheriff, get ahead of whatever's coming. Candace nodded in agreement. I'll hitch the wagon. Jimmy's in no condition to ride, and we need to make sure Harmon's men haven't taken control of the law. Within the hour, they were on the road to Timber Creek, the wounded Jimmy lying in the back of the wagon covered with blankets against the morning chill. Vaughn drove, with Candace beside him on the seat, the Winchester rifle across her lap and determination in her eyes. The town appeared quiet as they approached, no obvious signs of trouble. A few people moved along the boardwalks, going about their morning business. The sheriff's office sat at the far end of the main street, its weathered sign barely visible from a distance. "Seem normal to you?" Vaughn asked, scanning the buildings for any hint of ambush. "As normal as Timber Creek ever is," Candace replied, her own gaze equally watchful. "Though there are more horses at the livery than usual." They proceeded cautiously down the main street, aware of curious glances from townspeople who recognized Candace, and noted the armed stranger beside her and the wounded man in the wagon bed. Sheriff Markham was standing outside his office when they pulled up, his weathered face creased with concern as he recognized Candace. A tall man in his 50s with iron-gray hair and the steady gaze of someone who had seen the worst the frontier had to offer, Markham had been sheriff of Timber Creek for nearly a decade. "Mrs. Ackerman," he greeted, his eyes taking in the rifle in her lap and the tense set of her shoulders. "Heard there might have been trouble out your way last night." "More than trouble, Sheriff," she replied, climbing down from the wagon. "Harmon and his men attacked my ranch. Torches, guns, they meant to burn me out." Markham's expression darkened. "Got Harmon in Doc Simmons' office now, bullet in his chest. His men claim they were ambushed on the road." "That's a lie," Jimmy called weakly from the wagon bed. "We rode in to scare her into selling. Harmon said to burn the barn if she didn't agree." The sheriff's eyebrows rose as he moved to look at the wounded young man. "And you would be?" "Jimmy Newell, sir, I worked for Mr. Harmon." "And now you're turning on him." "He's dying anyway," Jimmy replied bluntly, "and I don't aim to hang for something that wasn't my idea." Markham sighed heavily, looking from Jimmy to Candace to Vaughn. "Better come inside, all of you. This is going to require some sorting out." The interior of the sheriff's office was spare but orderly, a desk, a gun rack, a wood stove for heat, and 2 cells in the back, currently empty. Markham helped Jimmy to a chair before settling behind his desk, taking out a pencil and paper. "Now then," he said, "start from the beginning." Candace related the events of the previous day and night, her account clear and concise. Vaughn added details where necessary, particularly regarding the firefight. Jimmy, seeming eager to distance himself from Harmon's schemes, corroborated their story and added information about Harmon's plans for the water rights. "Been after that spring of yours for years," Markham observed when they had finished. "Always figured he'd try something eventually, though I didn't think he'd go this far." He turned to Jimmy. "How many men does he have?" "7 counting me," Jimmy replied, "but 3 of them are just hired guns from Montana, only been with us a week or so." "And where are they now?" "Last I saw are at the hotel. Waiting to see if Harmon pulls through, I reckon." Markham nodded thoughtfully. "Well, Mrs. Ackerman, seems to me you were well within your rights defending your property. As for Harmon," he shook his head, "if he lives, he'll face charges. If he doesn't, his men will likely scatter, especially the hired guns." "And if they don't," Vaughn asked, "if they decide to finish what Harmon started?" "Then they'll answer to me," Markham said firmly, "and to the law." He looked at Jimmy. "You, young man, will be staying in one of my cells until this is sorted out. Consider yourself under protective custody." As they left the sheriff's office, Vaughn noticed a crowd gathering outside the doctor's office across the street. "News travels fast," he observed. "It always does," Candace agreed. "In a town this size, everyone knows everyone's business by sundown." They crossed to the general store, where Candace needed to purchase supplies: flour, coffee, ammunition to replace what had been used the previous night. The storekeeper, a portly man named Wilson, greeted her with obvious relief. "Mrs. Ackerman, heard there was shooting out at your place. Glad to see you're all right." "Thank you, Mr. Wilson," she replied. "We managed." The storekeeper's eyes shifted to Vaughn, curiosity evident. This would be the new hand folks are talking about. "Vaughn Young," Vaughn introduced himself, not bothering to correct the assumption that he was working for Candace. "Pleasure, Mr. Young. Any friend of Mrs. Ackerman's is welcome here." Wilson leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "Word is Harmon won't last the day. Bullet too close to his heart for the doc to remove." "Can't say I'm sorry to hear it," Candace said quietly, "though I take no joy in any man's death." Wilson nodded understandingly. "No one would blame you if you did after what he tried to do." He began gathering the supplies Candace requested, adding, "Miller from the Double J was in earlier, asking after you, Mr. Young. Said to remind you they ride out tomorrow at dawn." The reminder of the cattle drive and his imminent departure fell between Vaughn and Candace like a physical barrier. In the intensity of the previous day and night, he had almost forgotten that his time at Valley Ranch was temporary, a brief intersection of paths before he continued his solitary journey. They finished their business at the store in silence, loading the supplies into the wagon before heading to the livery to collect Vaughn's mare, which he had left in town. As they walked, their shoulders occasionally brushing in the crowded street, Vaughn found himself acutely aware of Candace's presence beside him. The faint scent of lavender that clung to her, the determined set of her chin, the quiet strength that had seen her through the attack on her home. At the livery, the ostler informed them that Harmon had indeed passed away just an hour earlier. The news spread quickly through the town, and by the time they were ready to return to the ranch, a sense of cautious relief had settled over Candace. "His men will likely leave now," she said as they drove out of town, Vaughn's mare tethered to the back of the wagon. "Without Harmon to pay them or drive them, there's no reason for them to stay." "Probably," Vaughn agreed, though a sense of unease still nagged at him, "but we should remain vigilant until we're sure." The "we" slipped out unbidden, an acknowledgement of a connection that had formed in the heat of danger and was now taking root in the quiet aftermath. Candace seemed to notice it too, glancing at him with a question in her eyes that neither was quite ready to voice. They reached the ranch by mid-afternoon, the autumn sun casting long shadows across the yard. Everything appeared undisturbed, the repaired fence standing strong, the chickens pecking contentedly in their coop, the horses grazing in the pasture. Only a few dark stains in the dirt near the corral and a handful of bullet holes in the house's siding remained as evidence of the previous night's violence. As they unloaded the supplies, working together with the easy coordination of those who have faced danger side by side, Vaughn found himself imagining a different future than the one he had planned. Instead of the cattle drive tomorrow and then another town, another job, another lonely trail, he saw mornings like this one, working alongside Candace, building something that would last, putting down roots that might withstand the harsh realities of the frontier. It was a dangerous thought, one that contradicted years of careful isolation. Yet it persisted, growing stronger with each shared glance, each brush of hands as they passed items between them. "I should check the north pasture," Candace said once the supplies were stored. "Make sure the horses are all accounted for after last night's commotion." "I'll come with you," Vaughn offered, not yet ready to be alone with his unsettling thoughts. They rode together, Vaughn on his chestnut mare and Candace on a sturdy gray gelding that moved with the easy gait of a well-trained mount. The north pasture stretched before them, green and gold in the autumn light, the spring that had been the source of Harmon's covetousness bubbling up from a rocky outcropping at its center. The horses were indeed all present, 15 fine quarter horses that represented not only Candace's livelihood but Thomas Ackerman's legacy. They counted and checked each one, finding them unharmed by the previous night's events. At the spring, they dismounted to let their horses drink. The water was crystal clear and cold, flowing steadily even in the dry autumn weather, a rare and valuable resource in the often parched territory. "I can see why Harmon wanted this," Vaughn said, watching the water bubble up from the earth. "A spring that runs year-round is worth fighting for out here." "It's not just the water," Candace replied, kneeling to trail her fingers through the cool stream. "It's what it represents, life, continuity, something that endures." She looked up at him, the sunlight catching in her honey-blonde hair and turning it to gold. "That's what Thomas and I were building here. Something that would last beyond us." Vaughn knelt beside her, drawn by something in her voice, in her words. "And now?" "Now I'm still building it," she said simply, "one day at a time. It's harder alone, but no less important." "You're remarkably brave," he observed. "Most women in your position would have sold and gone back east." A small smile touched her lips. "I'm not most women, Mr. Young. Surely you've noticed that by now." "I have," he admitted, finding himself returning her smile. "It's admirable." They remained by the spring for a time, talking of practical matters. The upcoming winter, the horses Candace planned to sell in the spring, the improvements she hoped to make to the ranch when funds allowed. Yet beneath the ordinary conversation ran a current of unspoken questions, of possibilities neither was ready to voice. As they rode back to the ranch house, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Vaughn made his decision. It was impulsive, contrary to everything he had believed about survival in the West, yet it felt right in a way few choices in his life had. "I'm not going on the cattle drive," he said suddenly, drawing his horse to a halt. Candace stopped beside him, surprise evident in her expression. "What?" "I'm staying," he clarified, "if you'll have me as a hand to start with. The ranch needs work before winter sets in, and you shouldn't be alone with Harmon's men still in the territory, even with him gone." "But I thought," she began, then stopped, studying his face carefully. "Why?" The question deserved an honest answer, one that Vaughn was only just beginning to understand himself. "Because for the first time in 8 years I've found somewhere that feels," he searched for the right word, "important. Somewhere worth fighting for. Somewhere worth staying for," he didn't add, though the thought was there, hanging between them in the golden evening light. Candace's eyes widened slightly, a mixture of hope and caution in their hazel depths. "And when winter passes, when the danger is gone?" "I don't know," Vaughn admitted. "I can't promise forever, Candace. I've been running too long to change overnight, but I can promise now, today, tomorrow, the day after that. And we'll see where it leads." It wasn't a declaration of love, not yet. It was something perhaps more precious on the frontier, a commitment to possibility, to taking the risk of connection despite knowing its potential cost. For a long moment Candace was silent, her face unreadable in the fading light. Then she nodded once, decisively. "The cabin is yours for as long as you want it," she said. "And there's always work for a good hand at Valley Ranch." They returned to the ranch house as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, a comfortable silence between them. The future remained uncertain. Harmon's men might still pose a threat. Winter would bring its own challenges, and Vaughn's restless nature might eventually call him back to the trail. Yet as they unsaddled their horses in the barn, working side by side in the lantern light, there was a sense of rightness, of pieces falling into place that had long been scattered. Later, standing on the porch of the main house after a simple supper, Vaughn looked out at the land that had drawn him to stay. The rolling pastures, the distant mountains, the small cluster of buildings that represented one woman's determination to build something lasting in a world of impermanence. "I'll speak to Miller tomorrow," he said. "Let him know I won't be joining the drive." Candace nodded, standing close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence in the cool evening air. "He won't be pleased." "No," Vaughn agreed. "But he'll find another hand. Good cowboys aren't as rare as," he hesitated, then finished the thought, "as people worth staying for." She turned to face him then, her expression open and vulnerable in a way it hadn't been before. "Are you certain, Vaughn? The West has taught me that nothing is guaranteed, not safety, not success, not even tomorrow." "That's precisely why I'm staying," he replied, reaching out to take her hand, the first such contact between them that wasn't born of necessity or danger. "Because I've spent 8 years believing your husband was wrong, that the frontier only takes, that connections only lead to loss. But watching you fight for this place, for your home, I'm beginning to think there might be another way to live out here." Candace's fingers tightened around his, warm and real in the gathering darkness. "There is," she said softly. "It's harder, riskier, but infinitely more worthwhile." The space between them seemed to diminish, the air charged with possibility. Vaughn was acutely aware of every detail, the faint scent of lavender that clung to her, the way the moonlight silvered her honey-blonde hair, the steadiness of her gaze as she looked up at him. "Candace," he began, uncertain what he meant to say but needing to say something. She saved him from having to find the words, rising on tiptoe to press her lips gently to his. The kiss was brief, a question as much as an answer, but it contained a promise that resonated through Vaughn like a physical force. When she pulled back, there was a new lightness in her expression, as if a decision had been made. "Good night, Vaughn," she said. "I'll see you in the morning." "Good night, Candace," he replied, watching as she entered the house, closing the door softly behind her. Alone on the porch, Vaughn looked up at the vast canopy of stars spread across the Montana sky. For 8 years he had measured his life in distances traveled, in towns left behind, in connections avoided. Now, standing on the porch of a ranch that had become more than just a temporary shelter, he found himself measuring in different terms, in fence posts repaired, in shared meals, in the gentle pressure of Candace's lips against his. The West might still take more than it gave. The frontier might still be unforgiving to those who dared to put down roots. But as Vaughn walked to his cabin in the moonlight, he realized that some risks were worth taking, some battles worth fighting, some people worth staying for. And perhaps, just perhaps, his father had been wrong. Perhaps there was a way to not merely survive the West, but to truly live in it, connected, rooted, whole. In the spring of 1874, when the last snow melted from the pastures of Valley Ranch and the first wildflowers bloomed along the creek, Vaughn Young and Candace Ackerman were married beneath the spreading branches of an old cottonwood tree. The ceremony was simple but joyful, attended by the handful of friends Candace had made during her years in Timber Creek, and the few hands Vaughn had hired to help with the expanding horse business. Sheriff Markham stood as witness, his weathered face creased in a rare smile as he watched the couple exchange vows. "Never thought I'd see the day," he confessed afterward, clapping Vaughn on the shoulder. "When you first rode into town, I had you pegged as another drifter passing through." "So did I," Vaughn admitted, his eyes finding Candace across the yard where she stood laughing with the storekeeper's wife. "Turns out I just hadn't found the right reason to stay." The winter had brought its own challenges: heavy snows, bitter cold, and two of Harmon's former men who had indeed sought revenge before Sheriff Markham tracked them down. But it had also brought Vaughn and Candace closer, their initial connection deepening into something neither had expected to find on the harsh frontier: a love built on shared struggles, mutual respect, and the daily choice to create something lasting together. As spring progressed into summer, Valley Ranch flourished. The horse business expanded, with Vaughn's knowledge of cattle operations bringing in new clients from ranches across the territory. They built a second barn, hired 2 permanent hands, and began planning for a future that stretched beyond the next season the next year. And when autumn came again, painting the hills in gold and crimson, Candace told Vaughn they would need to add a room to the main house before winter arrived. "For the baby," she explained, her eyes bright with joy as she placed his hand on her still flat stomach. "Due in spring, the doctor says." Vaughn, who had once believed the frontier offered only solitude and survival, found himself overwhelmed by a happiness he had never thought possible. In this woman, in this land, in the child growing beneath his palm, he had found not just a reason to stay, but a reason to build, to grow, to believe in a future where love could indeed tame the wild heart of the West. "Thomas was right," Candace said softly as they stood together on the porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold. "The West takes, but it gives even more to those brave enough to claim it." Vaughn pulled her close, marveling at how this one small corner of the vast, unforgiving frontier had become more than a stopover, more than a job, it had become home. "And you were right," he replied, pressing a kiss to her honey-blonde hair. "The joy outweighs the pain." As darkness fell and the first stars appeared above Valley Ranch, Vaughn Young, no longer a drifter but a man with roots deep in the Montana soil, looked out at the land that had changed him, at the woman who had shown him another way to live, and knew with certainty that some journeys were meant to end, some hearts meant to be claimed, some wanderers meant to find their way home at last.